Welcome! This tutorial will cover how to fill out Section A of FEMA's Elevation Certificate form correctly. It is part of a broader how-to series focusing on FEMA's elevation certificates, more specifically, how CRS would like you to complete them. For a full list of videos in this series, see the video description below. Let's first understand some basics about the Elevation Certificate, or EC as I'll call it from now on. The EC is technically FEMA Form 086-0-33, and the specific version of that form you'll want to fill out is dated December 2019. This form can be found in one of three ways. You can find it at the FEMA NFIP Underwriting Forms page at fema.gov/flood-insurance/find-form/underwriting. Just locate the link titled Elevation Certificate Form. You can also find this form simply by searching Elevation Certificate in your favorite search engine. And if neither of these methods work, you can always contact your CRS specialist or CRS resource specialist and ask if they can provide you with one or help you navigate to one. To verify you have the right form, locate the form's date in the bottom left-hand corner of each page. You can also tell which form it is from the expiration date in the upper right-hand corner. The current version's expiration date is November 30th, 2022. The current EC became effective February 21st, 2020. It replaced the 2015 form, but the 2019 form is essentially the same, with different effective and expiration dates. The most important thing to keep in mind is that the 2019 form was officially released by FEMA on February 21, 2020, and because of that, and the fact that FEMA is not allowing any grace periods, any EC signed and dated as of February 21, 2020 must be on the new 2019 form. Per the NFIP, or National Flood Insurance Program, a community is only required to obtain the elevation of the lowest floor of a building and the base flood elevation, so an EC is not a required document for NFIP purposes. However, once you join CRS, it is. Indeed, once you join CRS, you must require ECs on all new construction and substantial damage, substantial improvement in the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA. Failure to use ECs will result in removal from the program. ECs are primarily used for three main purposes: insurance ratings, to make sure the building is properly rated; NFIP compliance, as a way to document whether a building was constructed compliantly or not; and LOMAs. The EC is an integral part of the LOMA process to show whether the building is in or out of the SFHA. ECs filled out for LOMAs are not required to be submitted by CRS communities, so for the purposes of this training, we will not address ECs for LOMAs. As we begin this tutorial, it's worth noting that ECs come with their own set of instructions, including detailed diagrams. It also bears mentioning that ECs will be reviewed by many different parties, from insurance agents to your state NFIP coordinator, so please be sure to fill out each part of the form accurately and completely. Zeroing in on Section A of our EC, let's begin by looking at the first form field, labeled A1, Building Owner's Name. Since the ownership of buildings may change over time, and especially when they are getting built and transferred from a developer to the first homeowner, the name associated with a building is not that important for either insurance or compliance purposes, and therefore it is not required. What is most important in identifying a building is its address, or lacking a proper address, its property description. Either A2 or A3 must be filled out so that the building can be located in the community properly. The address or property description is essentially the key identifier for each form. Whether you use A2 or A3, know that city, state, and zip code must be filled in. Also, the address is used at the top of each of the 4 EC pages. If any of the addresses on each page differs, one of them is incorrect and will be considered an error. The addresses for each page must match up so that we know it's information for the same building on all the pages. A4 must be filled out. The three terms that are key are residential, non-residential, and accessory, since that's how the NFIP categorizes most buildings for both compliance and insurance purposes. But terms like addition and commercial, industrial, or housing complex helps as well. At a minimum, a term must be entered in this field that allows the reviewer to determine if the building is residential, non-residential, or accessory. A5 is not essential for CRS purposes. The address or property description in A2 or A3 is sufficient to locate the building. As for A6, photographs are not required for permitting purposes. Therefore, they are not required for CRS. However, they are required by insurance agents for writing policy and are very helpful for compliance records. So we strongly encourage you, as the community official, to require at least 2 photographs. 4 is desired if you can get them from the surveyor. And be sure they're of good quality so they can be seen clearly by you and when you submit them for CRS. The building diagram number is critical to an accurate EC. Without knowing the foundation type and which floor elevations are shown in C2A and C2B later in the form, it would be impossible to accurately rate an insurance policy and to know if the building was compliant. Pages 7 through 9 of the EC instructions show the 11 different building diagrams to be used for EC purposes. Become familiar with them so you know if the surveyor or engineer filling out the form used the correct diagram for A7. Diagrams should be very specific. You must use 1A or 1B. If you enter just a 1, it is considered an error. Fields A8 and A9 pretty much have to be discussed together since they both ask for the same basic information, but for different parts of the building. So we'll talk about A8 first, and then we'll see how the same logic applies to A9. A8 is information relating to the crawl space or enclosure of a building. Now, both crawl space and enclosure are tricky terms. A crawl space is used when you have a diagram 8 or 9 building, which is a building that attempts to elevate the floor above a rather shallow base flood elevation on a piece of property. An enclosure, as defined by the Flood Insurance Manual, is that portion of an elevated building below the elevated floor that is either partially or fully enclosed by rigid walls. Examples of an enclosure include a garage, storage, or utility room below the elevated floor of an elevated building. It can also be thought of as a garage, storage, or utility room attached and next to an elevated building with the enclosure floor lower than the elevated floor. Or it can be the crawl space below the lowest elevated floor. So in essence, an enclosure is an enclosed area below an elevated floor. Enclosures come into play in diagrams 6 and 7 buildings. Enclosures versus attached garages is a rather confusing issue. Be sure to pay attention over the next few minutes of this video to understand the difference between the two. So, if you have a building that has a crawl space or enclosure, the square footage of that crawl space or enclosure must be placed in A8A. And to help explain how these fields work together for both insurance and compliance, we'll use actual numbers. Let's say the size of the enclosure of our fake building is 700 square feet, so we put that number in A8A. Now, since the base flood elevation, or BFE, was above our existing ground elevation, we elevated a floor above that BFE to use as our living space, and we enclosed the area under that elevated floor. That's why we have an enclosure. But because this enclosure extends down below the BFE, to be compliant and to receive a better insurance rate, openings need to be placed in the walls to allow for equal water pressure on both sides of the wall in times of flooding. The NFIP tells us that we have to have at least 2 openings, and they must be within 1 foot above the adjacent grade, either outside the enclosure or inside the enclosure, whichever one is higher. The number of openings for this building are counted and placed in A8B. In our case, we have 6 openings. A8C asks us for the total area of those openings in square inches, because the NFIP requires that for every square foot of enclosed area, you must have at least 1 square inch of opening. Let's say our 6 openings are the typical 8x16 concrete block. So a typical concrete block is 128 square inches times 6 openings is 768 square inches. So we place that in A8C. A8D asks whether the openings that were placed in the foundation walls were engineered openings or not. One of these boxes needs to be checked. If neither are checked, we assume the answer to this question is no. But we'd prefer to have it checked so that whoever looks at this form knows definitively whether engineered openings were used or not. Obviously, if no openings are present, then A8D does not have to be checked. Our example does not use engineered openings, but for those that do, 8D must be marked yes, and an engineering opening certificate from either the International Codes Council Evaluation Service or a certified engineer must be attached to the EC. Be sure to use the Section D comments to describe the model number of the engineered vent if it's not clear which model is used on the certification itself. If an individual certification is used like the one seen here, it must capture 4 things. It must identify the buildings the openings are installed in. It must show the name, title, address, type of license, state issuing the license, signature, and seal. A statement certifying that the openings will equalize hydrostatic pressure on exterior walls by allowing for the automatic entry and exit of floodwaters, and the range of flood characteristics tested or computed, such as rates of rise and fall of floodwaters. Be sure you are requiring engineered opening certifications, and then when reviewing individual certifications like this, be sure to look at it closely to verify the 4 things we just discussed. And then obviously be sure to attach it to the EC when submitting them for review. Having anything missing on the certifications or failure to submit them with your ECs are considered errors. Both insurance and compliance need to know the rated size of these openings and that they meet the NFIP criteria. An important point to make about field A8C, total net area of flood openings, is that in the EC world there is currently concern over what number to place in A8C. Do you place the actual size of the openings, or do you enter the rated or engineered size of the openings? Well, it all depends on what FEMA guidance document you use. The EC instructions tell you to estimate the total net area of all such permanent openings in square inches, excluding any bars, louvers, or other covers of the permanent openings, and enter the total in item A8C. While Technical Bulletin 1, released in March of 2020, tells us that the total net area of flood openings in 8AB must be filled in with the total coverage or rated area of engineered openings. The stance from CRS is that basically you can do either. While the EC instructions tell you to enter the actual size of the openings, and we'd prefer surveyors fill them out this way, it will not be counted as an error if the rated or engineered size of the openings are used. Either way, if the actual size is placed in 8AC and the engineered opening certification is attached to the EC, like it's supposed to be, then the size of the openings can be calculated for proper insurance rating and compliance. If the rated size of the openings is used, that's the number that will be used for insurance and compliance anyway, so all will be fine. Reflecting on Section A8, these 4 fields are required because they tell you a lot about the foundation of the building, whether a building is compliant, and what kind of insurance rating the building is going to receive. If there is no crawl space or enclosure that exists in the building, then we'd prefer that NA was entered in all the fields, with A8D being left unchecked. If the fields are just left blank, we will accept this too, but an NA is encouraged since it tells the reviewer that the fields were considered. If there is an enclosure but no openings, 0 should be entered for 8AB and 8AC. Leaving them blank in this situation is an error. The fields in A9 work exactly the same as the fields in A8, with all 4 being required, with the possible exception of A9D if there are no openings for the building. Again, we'd prefer NA in all fields if no openings exist, but blanks are acceptable if that truly is the case for the building. Also, A9 deals with attached garages. This is another difficult term in the NFIP for insurance purposes and for understanding building diagrams. Generally speaking, an attached garage is a garage that is attached laterally to a non-elevated building, like this one. Non-elevated buildings are diagrams 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 3, 4, and 9 in the EC instructions. Details about these non-elevated buildings should be entered into A9. Elevated buildings are shown in diagrams 5, 6, 7, and 8, like the one shown here. Details about these types of structures should be entered in section A8 because the areas under the elevated floors in these buildings are enclosures, even though all or a portion of them may be used as a garage. We'll talk more about this when we talk about filling out elevations in Section C and how to identify lowest floors, attached garage floors, and how to use comments in Section D. As a general rule of thumb, if you have an elevated building, diagrams 5, 6, 7, or 8, there is no such thing as an attached garage, and so A9 should not be filled out. As simple as it sounds, enclosed areas under elevated floors are considered enclosures. So, all areas below that elevated floor should be added together and placed in A8. However, what's most important is that information about the building get relayed correctly to either the insurance agent or the compliance official. So, if the elevation of all floors and the use of each floor are given in A8 or A9 with an explanation in Section D comments area by the surveyor or Section G comments area by the local official, it will not be marked wrong for CRS purposes. As long as all appropriate floors and uses are identified, along with the elevations of each appropriate floor, it will be accepted. That makes this building a Diagram 6, and the information for that enclosure should be entered in Section A8. In addition, surveyors should use the comments area in Section D to explain anything that is not clear. It can also be used to include supplemental information beyond what the EC asks for. Let's review which parts of Section A of the EC are required. Required fields include A2 or A3, A4, A7, A8, and A9. Fields not required in Section A include A1, A5, and A6. There are 3 common errors we see in Section A. The first one is field A4 being left blank. Reviewers need to know if the property is residential, non-residential, or an accessory. The second error, which is the most common on all ECs, is entering the wrong diagram in field A7. Because insurance ratings and compliance are mostly tied to the lowest floor, and the diagram numbers indicate where the lowest floors are, when the wrong diagram number is chosen, you can easily have incorrect ratings and a building that may look non-compliant. Be sure to know the building diagrams and how to apply them properly. Take your time to look through them and understand them. The foundation type, not necessarily what the building looks like, is the key to getting the correct building diagram. The last, also very common error on ECs is not filling out A8 or A9 correctly. Knowing what an enclosure and what a garage is very important. Attached garages are attached laterally to the side of non-elevated buildings. That means that attached garages can only go with building diagrams 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 3, 4, or 9. Enclosures are those areas below elevated floors or attached next to elevated buildings and will only be associated with building diagrams 6, 7, or 8. Since there can be many errors on an EC, we will cover how to correct them in a separate video called How to Correct an Elevation Certificate. Be sure to watch that video for the various ways you can fix errors in an EC. That concludes our training on how to fill out Section A of the Elevation Certificate correctly. Please go to our next training video in this series, How to Fill Out Section B correctly. And thanks for watching.